The summer heat had rolled in earlier than expected that year, baking the quiet suburban neighborhood in a relentless wave of dry sun. Most of the houses along the tree-lined streets were uniform in appearance, each one carefully maintained under the watchful eyes of the homeowners association. To the casual observer, it seemed idyllic. Freshly painted fences, trimmed hedges, and lawns, so evenly cut they looked like green carpets stretched across the soil. But beneath the polished veneer was the iron grip of the HOA board, a group of residents who took pride in enforcing every rule to its strictest letter. The trouble began when Daniel, a new homeowner in the neighborhood, allowed his grass to grow just a little too long. He had been away on business for a week, and with a combination of rain showers followed by bursts of sunshine, his front yard sprouted several inches higher than the HOA's mandated length. To Daniel, it was a minor inconvenience. To the HOA, it was a violation worthy of punishment. When he returned home, he found the envelope taped to his front door. Inside was a letter citing his violation, along with a fine of $500. At first, Daniel thought it was a mistake. $500 for grass that had grown only slightly longer than the approved height? It was absurd. But the letter was clear. Pay the fine within 30 days, or face additional penalties. Frustrated, Daniel mowed the lawn immediately, cutting it back to regulation length. He hoped that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. A week later, another envelope appeared. This time it accused him of uneven grass cutting and claimed his yard did not meet the neighborhood's visual standards. Another $500 fine was attached. Daniel was stunned. He had mowed the grass himself, carefully, with the same diligence as any other homeowner. Yet the HOA seemed determined to find fault. Over the next month, the cycle repeated itself. Every minor detail, whether a dandelion sprouted between the blades or the edges near the walkway were not perfectly trimmed, was used as justification for another violation notice. Each letter was colder than the last, filled with bold text. In legal jargon, meant to intimidate. Daniel began to realize that this wasn't just about grass. The HOA board, particularly a few of its most vocal members, seemed to have singled him out. They wanted to make an example of him, to remind him that in this neighborhood, control belonged to them. Instead of feeling beaten down, Daniel felt something else stirring inside him. The unfairness of it all burned in his chest. Why should he be forced to maintain a cookie-cutter lawn just to appease a board of power-hungry neighbors? Why should nature itself be cut, trimmed, and tamed according to their arbitrary rules? It was on one of those long, frustrating nights, sitting at his desk, staring at the growing stack of violation letters, that an idea took root. If they wanted to fine him for grass being too long, what would they do if he turned his entire yard into something far more extreme? Not a simple patch of grass, but a full, thriving, unstoppable jungle. The thought was wild, ridiculous even. But the more he considered it, the more it made sense. He began researching local laws, digging into ordinances that outlined what homeowners could and could not plant on their property. And that's when he discovered something remarkable. While the HOA had rules about grass height, they had no restrictions on botanical gardens, conservation landscaping, or native plant sanctuaries. In fact, city law encouraged biodiversity and even granted protections for certain eco-friendly projects. If Daniel played this right, he could transform his yard into a dense, vibrant landscape that technically broke no rules. He could turn their obsession with control into their downfall. With a renewed sense of purpose, he began planning. He drew sketches, made lists of plants, and calculated how fast certain species would grow. Tropical-looking plants, tall grasses, thick shrubs, flowering vines. He wanted it all. By the end of his research, he had mapped out an entire ecosystem, a personal rainforest that would not only cover his yard, but stand as a living rebellion against the HOA's suffocating grip. The first seeds were planted quietly, without fanfare. A few ferns here, some ornamental grasses there. Daniel started small, knowing the HOA might not notice at first. But in his mind, the vision was clear, a sanctuary of green that would rise higher and stronger with every passing week. And so, the battle lines were drawn. The HOA thought they had won by slapping him with fines, but Daniel was no longer just defending his lawn. He was preparing for war. As the first sprouts pushed through the soil, Daniel couldn't help but smile. The HOA had demanded conformity. Instead, he would give them chaos. Chaos wrapped in legality, rooted in the very ground they thought they controlled. The jungle was coming, and the HOA had no idea what was about to grow right under their noses. The first few weeks passed quietly. At a glance, Daniel's yard still looked relatively normal. Patches of grass remained, but small clusters of unusual plants had begun to take root. A few neighbors noticed the subtle changes, raising their eyebrows at the exotic ferns and creeping vines that seemed out of place in the neat suburban landscape. But for the moment, no official complaints came. Daniel worked in silence, dedicating his weekends to planting and tending to his growing collection. He carefully chose species that were technically approved by city ordinances, but unusual enough to give his yard a wild appearance. Tall, ornamental grasses swayed in the breeze, towering higher than the HOA's allowed lawn length. Broad-leafed plants unfurled slowly, covering patches of soil and creating dense pockets of shade. Every choice was strategic. For every HOA rule about grass height, Daniel found a plant classification that made their regulation useless. It wasn't a grass anymore. It was a native conservation area, or a botanical garden. The board could fine him for unruly turf, but they couldn't touch a legally protected plant sanctuary. By midsummer, the transformation was undeniable. The once trimmed lawn was gone, replaced with a vibrant mosaic of greenery. The ground was hidden beneath layers of wildflowers, creeping ground cover, and thick moss. Bushes rose like small walls around the edges, giving the impression of seclusion. In the center, Daniel had planted saplings that grew faster than anyone expected, their branches already casting long shadows across the yard. It was no longer a lawn. It was the beginning of a rainforest. The HOA, however, finally noticed. Letters started arriving again, accusing Daniel of violating the community's aesthetic standards. The fines were reinstated, each one carrying threats of legal action if he didn't comply. But this time, Daniel didn't mow his yard down in frustration. Instead, he mailed back copies of city ordinances, highlighting the protections his plants enjoyed. He labeled his yard a conservation landscape and attached articles from government websites praising the benefits of biodiversity. The HOA board was furious. They weren't used to resistance, especially resistance backed by law. Still, they doubled down, holding emergency meetings and sending more aggressive letters. But the more they pushed, the faster Daniel expanded his jungle. Neighbors began talking. Some admired the lush, green oasis that seemed to transport them out of suburbia. Others complained that it made the street look messy, a violation of the uniform perfection they had grown accustomed to. Children were fascinated by it, peering through the leafy walls as if expecting to see wild animals inside. And in a way, they weren't wrong. Birds flocked to Daniel's yard, drawn by the new vegetation. Squirrels darted across branches while butterflies danced through the flowering plants. Nature was reclaiming the space, and with it came a vibrancy the rest of the neighborhood lacked. As the months rolled on, Daniel's jungle grew thicker. Vines climbed the walls of his house, weaving patterns across the siding. The saplings rose taller, their trunks hardening, their leaves spreading wider. The once quiet suburban lot now hummed with life, an entire ecosystem developing in plain sight. The HOA stepped up their fight. They threatened to sue, to forcibly remove the plants, to place liens on Daniel's property. But every threat hit a legal wall. Daniel documented everything from city regulations to environmental policies. He even secured recognition from a local conservation group, who praised his yard as an example of sustainable landscaping. With their endorsement, the HOA's case weakened further. Still, the tension grew. Members of the board began patrolling, past his house, snapping photos, muttering under their breath. On one of them, an especially controlling neighbor, often referred to as the Karen of the block, stood in front of his property for nearly an hour one afternoon, arms crossed, glaring into the foliage like it was a personal attack. But Daniel didn't waver. The more they pushed, the more determined he became. What started as a petty form of rebellion had become something bigger, a symbol of standing up to oppressive control. His jungle wasn't just plants. It was defiance, rooted deep in the soil, rising higher with every leaf and branch. By late summer, the transformation was complete. The house was nearly hidden from view, its facade veiled by greenery. From the street, it looked less like a suburban home and more like a jungle lodge transported from some distant rainforest. The HOA board could no longer ignore it, and neither could the rest of the neighborhood. Some neighbors secretly cheered for Daniel, tired of the HOA's stranglehold on their lives. Others whispered that his property value would drag theirs down. The board, meanwhile, grew more desperate. They began plotting new ways to trap Daniel in violations, ways that went beyond grass height. Trash cans left out too long, noise ordinances, even accusations about attracting pests. Every tactic was used, but the jungle was untouchable. It was legal, it was thriving, and it was more powerful than the HOA had ever expected. And then came the breaking point. The HOA announced an emergency inspection of Daniel's property, claiming they had discovered serious violations hidden within the foliage. They scheduled it publicly, making sure the whole neighborhood knew. It was their last stand, a desperate attempt to assert control. Daniel, however, was ready. He had been preparing for this moment since the first seed was planted. The stage was set, the HOA versus the jungle, and only one side was about to come out victorious. The day of the inspection arrived like a storm brewing on the horizon. For weeks, the HOA board had been whispering, plotting, and building their case against Daniel's jungle. Flyers had been quietly slipped into mailboxes, warning residents about hazards and eyesores threatening property values. The board promised that their inspection would expose the truth. that Daniel's so-called conservation project was nothing more than a blatant violation of community rules. Residents gathered early that morning, curious to witness the spectacle. Some leaned against cars, others peered from windows, all waiting to see how far the HOA would go. The board members arrived in a small procession, clipboards in hand, expressions tight with determination. At the head of the group was the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer, Karen, her lips pressed into a thin line, eyes narrowed like a hawk circling prey. Daniel, meanwhile, was calm. He had spent the past month preparing for this very moment. His jungle wasn't just random growth. It was carefully cataloged, every plant identified, every placement documented. He had permits, ordinances, and letters of support from conservation groups neatly filed in a binder, ready to counter every accusation. When the board stepped onto his property, the jungle seemed to swallow them whole. The narrow walkway was lined with towering grasses that swayed above their heads, the air thick with the scent of blooming flowers and damp earth. Vines coiled along the railings, and the rustling of unseen creatures echoed through the greenery. To the board members, it felt less like a suburban inspection and more like stepping into a wild, untamed forest. Karen immediately began scribbling notes, pointing at every patch of foliage as if each leaf were a crime. She muttered about invasive species, about rodent infestations, about safety hazards. Her voice grew louder with each accusation, meant not just for the clipboard, but for the audience gathering at the curb. The board wanted a show, and Karen was determined to deliver it. But Daniel knew their performance wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. One by one, he watched them poke and prod at plants, misidentifying species, misinterpreting what they saw. They pointed at a cluster of tall native grasses, calling them weeds. They gestured toward a shaded corner, claiming it was harboring pests, even though it was nothing more than decorative ferns. What they didn't expect, however, was that Daniel had already anticipated each move. He had photographs of the same plants labeled correctly, printouts from environmental agencies confirming their legitimacy, and endorsements from city officials praising his sustainable landscaping. As the board stumbled deeper into the greenery, their frustration grew. The jungle wasn't cooperating with their narrative. Instead of a messy, neglected yard, it was clearly a carefully designed ecosystem. Birds flitted overhead, pollinators hovered among flowers, and the space pulsed with life in a way no sterile, rigorous, regulation-approved lawn could replicate. The neighbors, watching, began to murmur. Some were impressed, whispering that Daniel's yard looked beautiful, even enchanting. Others, long frustrated with the HOA's heavy-handed tactics, started to see the inspection for what it was, a desperate attempt to crush a homeowner who refused to bow. Karen, however, refused to back down. She demanded to see the house siding, claiming the vines could be damaging the structure. She insisted on measuring the height of plants, declaring them in violation of aesthetic balance. She even accused Daniel of creating a fire hazard with dense vegetation. But each time, Daniel calmly countered. He produced documentation showing that his vines were a non-damaging ornamental species, approved for residential use. He presented studies proving that his native grasses reduced fire risk rather than increased it. He held up letters from the local conservation authority certifying his property as a wildlife-friendly habitat. With every rebuttal, Karen's face grew redder, her voice shriller. What was meant to be a triumphant display of HOA power was unraveling into a public humiliation. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, their clipboards growing lighter as each note they scribbled was rendered irrelevant by Daniel's meticulous preparation. Finally, after hours of scrutiny, the board had nothing left. Their inspection had yielded no violations they could legally enforce. Instead of exposing Daniel as a rule breaker, they had revealed their own ignorance and desperation. The neighbors, once silent observers, now openly voiced their opinions. Some applauded Daniel's composure, praising his commitment to nature. Others shook their heads at the board's behavior, muttering that the HOA had gone too far this time. What was supposed to be a display of authority had backfired spectacularly, but the battle wasn't over. Karen refused to accept defeat. That evening, she and a small group of board loyalists convened an emergency meeting. They vowed to find another angle, another loophole, another way to crush Daniel's rebellion. If they couldn't beat him with grass height, they would attack from another direction. Perhaps noise, pests, or even accusations of lowering property values. Daniel, however, knew this was coming. He understood that the HOA would never let go quietly. The jungle had become more than a yard. It was a threat to their control, a symbol that their authority could be challenged. As night fell, the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves filled Daniel's property. The jungle was alive, thriving, untouchable, but in the distance, behind closed doors, the HOA plotted its next move. The showdown had ended in Daniel's favor, but the war was far from over, and the final battle, the one that would decide not just his fate, but the very balance of power in the neighborhood, was about to begin. The failed inspection left the HOA bruised, but not broken. Karen and her loyalists refused to let go of their vendetta. To them, Daniel's jungle was not just a nuisance, it was a direct challenge to their authority. And in neighborhoods like this, authority was everything. Within a week, new letters began arriving at Daniel's home. This time, they weren't about grass or plants. The HOA accused him of harboring pests, claiming his thick vegetation attracted rodents. They cited noise complaints, alleging that birds and insects were disturbing the peace. They even tried to argue that his overgrown yard was reducing property values across the block. It was a barrage of paper warfare, violation notices piling one after another. Each letter was more aggressive than the last, filled with threats of lawsuits, liens, and forced removals. But Daniel was ready. He had expected this escalation, and he had already built his defense. First, he hired a pest control inspector to certify that his property had no infestations. Then he contacted a wildlife society who praised the birdsong in his yard as a sign of ecological health. And when the HOA tried to drag property values into the fight, Daniel produced an appraisal from a local real estate expert who pointed out that unique and eco-friendly properties often sold for higher prices, not lower. Each counterstrike weakened the HOA's case, but Karen was relentless. She called emergency meetings, rallied neighbors to her cause, and even spread rumors that Daniel's jungle would destroy the neighborhood. But the harder she pushed, the more cracks began to appear in the board itself. Not every resident hated the jungle. Some loved the natural beauty it brought. Others, long tired of Karen's overbearing control, began to side with Daniel out of sheer principle. Whispers spread at backyard barbecues and block gatherings. Maybe the HOA had gone too far this time. The tipping point came when a local news crew showed up. Word of Daniel's legal jungle had reached beyond the neighborhood, and reporters were eager to cover the story. Cameras filmed the lush greenery, the vibrant flowers, the birds fluttering between branches. They interviewed Daniel, who calmly explained how he had built a legal, sustainable ecosystem in the middle of suburbia. The segment aired that evening, painting Daniel as a creative homeowner fighting back against an oppressive HOA. Viewers loved it. Comments flooded in online, mocking the board and praising Daniel's ingenuity. What had started as a neighborhood feud was now a public relations disaster for the HOA. Under pressure, the board scrambled. They attempted one last desperate move, a lawsuit claiming Daniel's jungle violated the community's uniform aesthetic. But Daniel's lawyer dismantled their argument in court, pointing out that the HOA's bylaws had no enforceable language against botanical gardens or conservation landscaping. The judge dismissed the case, and in doing so, stripped the HOA of its ability to fine Daniel further. The jungle had won. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift. Karen, once the loudest voice on the board, faced mounting criticism from her neighbors. Her constant crusades had drained the HOA's funds and embarrassed the community on a public stage. Eventually, a petition circulated calling for her removal from the board. It gained signatures faster than anyone expected. By the next election, she was gone. Daniel, meanwhile, thrived. His property became a local attraction, a symbol of individuality and resilience. Families walked by just to admire the greenery. Children played along the edges, marveling at the butterflies and birds. Even neighbors who once complained began to soften, admitting that the jungle gave the block a unique charm no manicured lawn could match. What began as retaliation had grown into something much greater. Daniel's jungle was no longer just a personal rebellion. It was a reminder that conformity wasn't the only way to live. It stood as proof that one person could push back against unfair control and win, not through brute force, but through persistence, creativity, and the law itself. As the seasons changed, the jungle only grew richer. Leaves turned gold in autumn. Branches held snow in winter, and by spring, new blossoms painted the yard in colors no HOA-approved lawn could ever rival. Nature thrived where rules once tried to suffocate it. Daniel often sat on his porch, looking out at the dense, living world he had cultivated. The air was fresher, the sounds more alive, the space more his own than any trimmed and tamed yard could have been. The battle was over, the HOA defeated, and the jungle secure. In the end, the story spread far beyond the neighborhood. Online forums, news articles, and social media all retold the tale of the homeowner who planted a jungle to fight his HOA, and won. It became a legend of suburban resistance, a viral story of justice wrapped in leaves and vines. The HOA had tried to bury him in fines. Instead, Daniel planted roots too deep for them to pull out. And in the heart of suburbia, where conformity once ruled, a jungle now stood victorious.